Till then, my darling, please wait for me. Till then, no matter when it will be, one day I know I'll be back again. Please wait. Till then, our dreams.
World War II raged from 1939 to 1945. It was fought primarily in Europe and the South Pacific. Yet Chicago was at the center of the fight, and so were her people.
I'm Bill Cullerton, and I'm 74 years old.
My name is Bob Emone, and I'm 75 years old.
Yolanda Hall, 75 years old this year.
Dempsey J. Travis, age 77.
My name is William R. Thompson. I am 81 years of age.
My name is Mario Martinelli. I'm 81 years old and going strong.
Jack Hughes, used to be called John Kelly Hughes. I'm 82.
My name is Studs Turkle, 85, born the year the Titanic sank.
My name is Margaret Hein Abramson. I was 86 in February.
This is a story of Chicago during the period some called the Good War. It is told by the people who lived it.
Till then, when I will hold you again, please wait. Till then.
Dr. Perry Dewis is an historian at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is co-author of the acclaimed book, We've Got a Job to Do, Chicagoans and World War II. The story starts a few years before.
Chicago had had a very difficult decade with the Great Depression.
I was at DePaul University. I started in 1929. I graduated in 33, but I did take courses in social work because I knew there was no jobs in the business world.
Mom and Grandma, they had a house at 84th and Morgan, and times were tough, and they didn't want to lose the house.
Nobody had nothing.
Everybody pitched in with each other.
We really don't know exactly what the unemployment rate was because people had stopped searching for work, but a lot of that had started to turn around about 1938, 39.
But just as Chicagoans were beginning to feel secure again, war clouds were gathering. Hitler was moving across Europe, and there was growing apprehension in the Far East. On October 5, 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt came to Chicago to dedicate the Outer Drive Bridge. Thousands listened as he warned that the spread of Japanese imperialism might have to be checked by other nations.
I have been compelled to contrast our peace with very different scenes that are being enacted in other parts of the world.
In 1940, the situation in Europe grew so threatening that Congress enacted the first peacetime conscription.
Men were going into the service, and we knew that one of these days it's going to happen.
You can never forget that where you were when Pearl Harbor occurred.
Being only 11, of course, I didn't know how serious it was, but they were pretty upset on the radio. So I ran upstairs to tell my father that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, not knowing really what I was saying.
Pearl Harbor? I was sitting on a neighbor's front porch listening to the Bears football game.
I was in a soap opera. I was a gangster in soap opera. I was at NBC, 19th floor. I figured it may have been Ma Perkins, A Woman in White. And sure enough, our soap opera was cut off. We all heard it, and we listened to FDR.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war.
And my brother walked in, coming home from Mass, and he heard it, and he says, "I'll be the next one to go."
The Chicago Police Department rushed to protect the Michigan Avenue Bridge and other installations. There was an immediate concern.
People were coming in and they were saying that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And you know where Pearl Harbor was. Nobody ever heard about it.
I was there.
And indeed he was. Mortimer Abramson's family moved from New York in 1927, and he spent his formative years in Chicago. In 1940, he found himself ripe for the draft and enlisted.
I wanted to have my choice of the branch of service, and I wanted the Marines.
He was training on a ship near Hawaii on that morning of December 7, 1941.
As the bombs were being dropped on Pearl Harbor, the ship's gunnery officer ran through the Marine compartment on the USS Northampton and said, "Men, this is the real thing."
The war began for Mortimer Abramson and everyone else. He would soon serve with valor in 13 actions against the enemy and find the love of his life in Chicago. That part of his story later.
I went in before the war. I went in March of '41.
Mario Tonelli's story is typical of many Chicagoans at the time.
My father came to America first and left my mom back home with a brother and a sister. And then after he got established here and got some money and went back, and he brought them all back.
He became a gifted high school athlete. One evening in his senior year, a priest came by his home accompanied by a football coach from Notre Dame, who talked with young Mario.
When they left, I would say my mother and father made the decision for me where I was going to go. They said it's a Catholic school, it's not far from here, and you know.
He starred at Notre Dame and after graduation joined the Chicago Cardinals as a fullback.
I was with the Cardinals 1 year. Then I went to the Army after that. First year I was with them.
Tonelli's wife moved in with his folks, and he shipped out for the Philippines.
When I heard about Pearl Harbor, I was at Clark Field, and as we were coming out of launch, there were about 54 planes up in the air coming in. But before we knew it, the bombs were starting to drop on. They started to hit Clark Field. They damaged Clark Field pretty good.
And then the Japanese attacked by land.
We fought for about 80 days before we surrendered. And every day got worse. Less ammunition, less food, more people were getting sick.
They were herded together by the Japanese and told to start walking. It would later be called the Bataan Death March.
The entire Death March covered about 70 miles, and we did it in 7 days. That's about 10 miles a day, which really isn't much. But when you don't have water, you don't have food, in the hot sun, it's a long way. And with the fellows that had malaria, with beriberi, and all these different diseases, a lot of them couldn't go on, and they just dropped. We'd pick them up and try to carry them, but and if you left them there, they would get shot, they'd get bayoneted. I was sick. I had malaria. I had malaria a lot. And I came down with the chills and the fevers and the sweats and everything, and we were losing 70 men a day there in the hospital.
In all, some 10,000 men died during the ordeal. Somehow, Mario Tonelli survived. Eventually, he and about 1,000 other Americans were put on a boat and sent to a prison camp in Japan to perform hard labor. As conditions worsened for Americans captured in the Philippines, things turned ugly for Japanese Americans at home. One of them was Robert Emon, then of Los Angeles. On December 7, 1941, he was a student at UCLA.
I was studying for a physics test Sunday, And on the radio, I heard the news about the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. And that really surprised me. We had to take my parents down to the city hall, and they had to answer a lot of questions, get fingerprinted. We lost our restaurant, yes, and we just had to evacuate.
Some 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated. The Emon family was sent to a center in Wyoming.
We were in a concentration camp for all intents and purposes.
They remained there for about 2 years, and then there was a change.
They were asking people to leave camp to go out to the city and work or go to school, so we got our clearance, and I left in about April or May for Chicago.
There were 20,000 Japanese Americans who were brought in from the detention camps in the desert and were brought into Chicago.
Well, the reason I chose Chicago was my sister was living out here, and she already had a place to stay, and she said, come on out, so I left and came to Chicago.
And when the people began to be shipped in here in late 1942, in particular, there was some concern about how they would be accepted.
When we first came in, they asked, are you an Eskimo? We said no, and we said, I was Japanese American, and they didn't seem to have any prejudice.
They wanted to prevent the creation of what people referred to as little Tokyos. And so they were scattered on the north and south sides, kind of a linear pattern along Clark Street on the north side and a few other places.
We were loyal. I already registered for the draft. I never felt I had to prove that I was an American.
And so in 1945, Robert Emon entered the United States Army and served his country. If Chicago's new Japanese population was accepted without prejudice, things were somewhat different in regard to the city's old and very large German community.
People were very suspicious of anyone who was German.
The Reverend Thomas Henry serves the St. Paul's United Church of Christ in the heart of what was once Chicago's North Side German-American blue-collar neighborhood. He recently authored a book about the history of his church.
There were federal agents who came and sat in on worship services here at St. Paul's Church. And they listened to make sure that nothing was being preached from the pulpit against the United States. The German Americans really were against the U.S. entering the war because they feared that the young men, particularly who would be going from here and serving the armed forces, could well be fighting their relatives in Germany.
Jewish Chicagoans were also concerned for their relatives in Europe, but for a very different reason.
The Jewish community was very aware of what was going on in Europe. I think if there is a myth, there is around it is that America was ignorant of the Holocaust. That's not at all the case. I think what America wasn't aware of perhaps was the size of the tragedy that was going on. The Jewish community was very active, not only from general patriotic activities, but also in trying to rescue people, in trying to keep the press aware of what was going on.
And when called upon, Jewish Americans as well as German Americans didn't hesitate to fight.
They still were primarily Americans and saw themselves as Americans, and were very supportive of the United States once the United States decided to enter the war. One man in the congregation who's still here today said that when he enlisted in the U.S. Army, he was asked the question, what is your allegiance? You are a German background, what is your allegiance? And he said simply, I am an American. And that was pretty clear.
George Gutterly was born within walking distance of St. Paul's Church.
My grandparents, all four of them, came from Germany. I enlisted in September of '42, and I hadn't yet turned 20. My dad had a sign for me because I wasn't, at that time you had to be 21 to enlist. And Mother wasn't very happy with my dad signing, but Dad said, what the heck, he'll go down and enlist anyhow and lie about it.
Gutterly joined the Army Air Corps and became a gunner on a B-17.
Well, we were flying out of Foggia, Italy, a little town called San Severo, north of Foggia. And I was shot down on my 13th mission. I bailed out at an altitude of 24,500, and the tail gunner bailed out landed in a lake. When I got down to the ground, there were about 5 or 6 people coming up the hill. I thought they were waving sticks at me, but they were shooting at me, so I didn't hang around to wait. I was shot on the 12th, and I wasn't captured until the 19th. I was captured on the Swiss-Austrian border.
A German officer interrogated him. Gutterly gave only his name, rank, and serial number.
He would get angry and pound on the table, and he said to me, Guterlei, that's a German name, isn't it? And I said, yeah. He said, your parents come from Germany? I said, no. Or were you in Germany? No. I said, your parents come from Germany? No. Your grandparents? I said, yeah. My grandparents were smart enough to get out of this friggin' country. And I spent 3 days in solitary.
Wayland Buchholz also comes from a German heritage.
Well, I grew up in Palmer Square. I went to school at the Lane Tech for 4 years. The last year, I enlisted into the Air Force.
It was 1943. Buchholz also became a gunner and also found trouble in the skies over Europe.
We flew 14 missions. On the 14th, we were shot down.
They were captured and soon found themselves in a prison camp in what is now Poland.
It's a brand new camp. We slept in tents and that.
And then something happened that would turn out to be very lucky for Wayland Buchholz. It came in the form of George Gutterly.
After we got to this camp, we'd wander from one barracks to another, looking for familiar faces, guys that you flew with or people that you grew up with. And I went into the room and said, anybody from Chicago? And Buck said, yeah, I'm from Chicago. I said, where from?
I'm from Palmer Square. He says, well, so am I. Area.
I said, what's your name? Buchholz. I said, oh, then you're Wendell's brother. And I knew his older brother, and we struck up a very close friendship after that.
It was unbelievable. 2 kids from the same Chicago neighborhood found each other in a prison camp that contained some 10,000 Allied airmen. It soon became apparent to them that there would be a change. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The Russian front was moving toward them.
On the 6th of February, we're told you're going to start marching.
When we marched, got out of camp and started marching, we marched for 86 days and over I think it's 602 miles. And what I did was I put 2 pairs of socks on, because I learned that playing basketball at Lane, the coach always says, wear 2 pairs of socks so you won't get blisters. And that stuck in my mind. And that's what I did. I never got a blister on the march.
This is my Lane ring, and I had it all through POW camp. And I wear it today because when fellows were so desperately ill and hungry on the march, they'd say, well, what can we, the Germans say, well, you want some bread? What have you got to trade? And a lot of the guys traded off their high school rings, and the Germans said to me, I'll give you 2.5 loaves of bread for that ring. I said, after I'm dead, you can take it off of me, but I'm not going to give it to you. It's just pure orneriness.
I estimated that I was down to about 100 pounds.
Yeah, he was ready to give up. I kept track. I think we had about 2 pounds of bread and about 5 pounds of potatoes for the 3 months that we were on the march. And we became desperately ill. And we got to this one place where they had what they called a sick barn. So one day I walked into the sick barn, and there's Buck. And he was ready to give up. And I figured, gee, I've known this guy, and he's like a kid brother to me because I'm 3 years older than him. And so I figured, gee, I got to do something to get some food for him.
I don't know what you call those 5-gallon milk cans, you know, they had, and there was out in the courtyard. And George went out and got it.
And walked out there, grabbed the can of cream in front of God and everybody. The German guard didn't pay attention to me. He figured anybody who is gutsy enough to go out and do that must belong there. And I took it into the sick barn.
Really kept the coals burning on me and working on this here. Because you're so weak you couldn't walk.
And Buck later on said that if he hadn't had that cream, he wouldn't have made it. We estimate about 1,500 that died in the march. They were liberated on May 2nd or 3rd up near Hamburg. I I missed the last 130 miles because I escaped.
Not everyone was so lucky, like the tail gunner who bailed out with George Gutterly and drowned in a lake. Mitchell Pecos was a Polish-American kid from South Suburban Harvey. His younger brother, Bill.
There are 8 kids in my family, and you can probably see the one photograph that I have, and I'm the one that's on the very base, and the boy that's right up on the top was the brother of question. And as I remembered him when I was 4 years of age, when he came home from leave, he was hiding, behind the door. And I quickly ran in, "Where's Mitchell?" Like that, which is a normal thing to do for a youngster. And then I found him and he lifted me up to the sky and down. He was late teens. I think he probably would have to be late teens, at that time. You have to remember what the crew of the airplane, the B-17, was like. They were late teenagers and early 20. The news of his death was a very interesting thing because it left a lot of feelings within me, because my mother was not willing to accept, that he was dead. And there was some feeling that he may be wandering off someplace in Europe. My brother now is buried in St. Avold, and that's what's known as the Lorraine American Cemetery, and that's located in France. And I happened to go there multi-times, and that's another emotional time too. And, well, anyway.
About 400,000 Chicagoans went to war.
It seemed everybody in the neighborhood. My Uncle Frankie, he was 29 years old, and he went into the service May 31st, 1943. That was his birthday. My cousin Jackie went into the service. He went in even before that.
People lined up and sat outside of enlistment centers overnight trying to get in and to get involved.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille. He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
My Uncle Frankie, he must have been on leave before he was going out to California. And that's our front yard on Sangamon Street, and he was teaching us all how to march back and forth across the front yard. And you can see the look on my grandfather's face, the strain. He had just lost his son, and this was his son's boy, his oldest boy that was going into war.
The first part of the war did not go all that well for the United States, and there was some fear that we were going to lose it.
I'd come home from school, and I remember my grandmother sitting in this rose-colored chair in the living room saying her rosary for all the soldiers.
There were a lot of rumors that the Germans had long-range bombers, that they could fly over the Arctic and could hit Chicago.
My dad was the air raid captain. He was the captain of our block, and it was a major thing. Everybody had to pull their shades down, and he would look out to make sure all the shades were down in the block, and we were so proud that he was the air raid captain. And we were afraid the war was going to come to 78th and Sangamon Street or into the neighborhood when we had those drills.
There was no way that you could hide from the war. It affected you whether you wanted to or not. People participated many ways. They bought heroic amounts of bonds. They participated through scrap drives, through trying to collect aluminum and rubber and paper for the war effort.
We had paper drives at Leo, and of course at home we saved the grease.
Collection of fat was an idea supposedly of Mayor Kelly, who had read that fat could be converted into nitroglycerin. Victory gardens were another very important part of this process. They were communal in a lot of ways. People were encouraged to farm in large mass plots as well as putting things in their backyards. Portions of the Chicago parks were plowed over for victory garden purposes.
We just went down there with seeds, put them in the backyard, dug it up, and we'd have enough every night.
I was president of the Clean Plate Club of Glencoe.
I do remember the rationing, though. We had to stand in line for hours to get meat, and you had the rationing cards.
Things like tires and gasoline were also a ration.
I gave up drinking sugar in my coffee at that time so my mother could have my sugar to bake with. She was a great baker.
By the way, there was very little there was black marketeering, but surprisingly little, because the people more or less pitched in. They knew this was an all-around effort over and beyond. It was no little military adventure.
I remember there was shoe rationing.
There was new mode hosiery, 78th and Halsted, and the women would be lined up for blocks trying to get a pair of nylons.
Live chickens were not rationed, so that we'd get live chickens. Were not very expensive.
John Long went into the Army in 1942. He was stationed in Chicago and trained to become a doctor.
They paid for my books, paid my tuition, and gave me an allowance to live on. I think they $75 a month. In those days, it was pretty good. And at the end of your internship, then you were obligated to go in the service as a first lieutenant. And in medical school, the first year we had the physiology course. They had wonderful big bullfrogs that we had to work with. At the end of the day, my partner in the lab would cut the legs off of all the frogs and skin them out. We'd take them home. We had 160 in the class, so we had 160 pair of frog legs. And we'd cook those up, and we could go down and you could buy from Weebolt Wonder Beer, which was 20 cents a bottle. And we would have big parties of the medical students would come over. Every Saturday we had to have close order drill. And sometimes if an exam was coming up, to try to skip it, but they took roll call, and if they caught you, they put you over in the YMCA, which was on Congress Street and Wood Street. There was a big YMCA, and it was occupied by the captured German prisoners. So they'd put you to work in the kitchen, but the prisoners did all the work, and it really wasn't bad duty, and you got a good meal while you were there.
There were several hundred German prisoners of war who were brought into the Chicago area, in large part to help fill the tremendous labor shortage that existed here. There was a very dramatic turnaround in the Chicago status as an industrial center in the war. By the end of the war, over 1,400 Chicago factories were producing war goods. If you owned a factory that, well, let's say made insoles, I'm thinking of the Dr. Scholl company that made various kinds of things that you put in your shoes. This company was suddenly banned from producing the regular product, so they were put to work making parachutes instead.
It happened all over Chicago. Suddenly, a place like Helene Curtis was no longer manufacturing products for women. Co-founder Gerald Gidwitz.
We made bomb release mechanisms. We made radar for the Navy. We made a small radar for the Air Force. We made gun turrets with 30 caliber machine guns on them.
It was clear that the industrial expansion soon depleted the ranks of the unemployed in terms of the usual laborers, particularly white males. And so what you did was to find ways to expand that workforce. Some 60,000 African Americans came from the South to Chicago to work in the war factories and became a very important part of the war effort.
I knew there were a lot of women working in factories, like Rosie the Riveter, my neighbor now, worked at the Ford plant, which was then an aviation plant.
Yolanda Hall was one of them as well. Her parents were Hungarian immigrants who arrived in Chicago in the depths of the Depression. They found work and raised and educated their children. Yolanda and her husband Chuck were married just before the war broke out.
We discussed about the importance of winning the war against the Axis and defeating fascism. And we agreed, since we had no children and he had the experience of fighting in Spain, that he should enlist. And so a week or so after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted and he left on January 12, 1942. I enrolled at Lane Tech and took a course to become a tool grinder, which was a skilled job.
She enrolled because she wanted to do her part in the war effort. Soon she found work at Bendix Aviation in the Westtown neighborhood.
And I became the first woman to go in the tool room. The maintenance department and the tool room were men's preserves. And they would do things like hide tools on me and give me misleading information. And then at night, my father and my uncle would help me read blueprints, and I would get sort of extra coaching from them. So it wasn't before long that I could do my job pretty well. And I must say that the guys in the tool room turned around quite a bit. And eventually they voted for me for steward of the department, and later I became president of the union local, so the guys were, you know, they were willing to learn.
Before it was over, some 40 to 50,000 Chicago women went into the factories.
Well, Chicago functioned as a military hub of very great importance during the war. First of all, it was a transportation crossroads, but it was also, because of its transportation location, a major training ground for military personnel. Fort Sheridan was upgraded as a major processing center. Great Lakes Naval Training Center gave basic training to 1/3 of the United States Navy that served in the war. The University of Chicago trained meteorologists, language experts. Northwestern University's Naval Midshipman program was the largest in the United States, and such people as Johnny Carson and John F. Kennedy did their officer training work at the Northwestern Center. Probably the most interesting story about the military training in the war involved training pilots. The problem was that they needed to find some way to simulate the conditions of aircraft carriers. And the only way to do that was to buy 2 old lake steamers, which were transformed into aircraft carriers, and floated them out in the lake. And somewhere over 20,000 pilots were trained for the Naval Air Corps out of those facilities. You had USOs in the Chicago area, but the servicemen centers that were operated by the Park District were really more important in terms of the number of military personnel who were served.
I ran the center at the Lincoln Park Center, so it was a very active time in my life. There wasn't a thing that the servicemen couldn't have. They had entertainment tickets anywhere they wanted to go. They had food, they had lodging.
Some of my girlfriends and I would bake cakes and go down to the USO and dance with the fellas or help them write letters, things like that.
But the kids from small towns were really the ones that appreciated what they found in Chicago.
The center and the auditorium theater, by the end of the war, had served nearly 25 million meals to military people passing through.
People got together. It was united everyone.
Chicago was one family.
There was no question that the country was united.
And that's because it was serious business, very serious.
One thing is that the boy across the street was killed, and I'd never known anyone who died, much less being killed in the war.
Everyone had a flag in the window.
Well, you had a basic flag that had a blue star on it for each person from the family who was in the service, and of course some families had multiple stars. The flag that no one wanted in their window was the gold star because it meant a casualty.
Well, this they put on the light pole, right on the corner, see, because we lived on the corner. And if it was right when they put it up, or a day or so, whatever it was, those two soldiers came, and they shot off a couple of rounds, you know, like a ceremony.
Leonard Wyer's brother Ellis died during the invasion of Anzio in Italy. He was an Irish kid who had grown up in a family of 9 children, raised by a widowed mother.
My brother Ellis enlisted, and my mother didn't want him to because he was the last one home besides me. No, she told him to stay home, but he wanted to go and serve his country. Well, got the news, and I know she's all broken up over it. I remember my mom when she was laying in bed crying away, and he got killed, and had the priest over praying for her and all. You know, mothers don't raise kids for stuff like that. In his yearbook and for school, somebody wrote in it, to a guy that could fight with no hands. I mean, I'm sorry. He was, this guy.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. Just you wait and see.
Human drama was being played out on the south side of the city at the campus of the University of Chicago.
Chicago was, of course, the birthplace of the atomic age.
It was called the Manhattan Project, and one of the young scientists recruited from the East was John Simpson.
In Chicago, almost immediately, I was immersed in the problems of the war effort, and here we were principally focused on the development of plutonium as a means to developing a bomb. I had a small share in the effort.
The people who worked on the project couldn't tell their wives about it.
It was an elite group of 40 physicists working under the direction of a brilliant Italian named Enrico Fermi.
When it came time to finish the first chain reaction, no one knew really whether it was going to be, how fast it would go critical, although Enrico Fermi actually made very good estimates of the timing and the growth rate. But not knowing what would happen in Hyde Park, the security quietly posted radiation buttons in the trees, you know, just in case, so we'd have a record of what was there if something happened.
Well, finally, on December 2nd, 1942, the chain reaction took place.
This whole thing went through without a failure. It was a beautiful experiment.
And then someone was designated to send a telegram to President Roosevelt saying the Italian navigator has landed in the New World, which was in its own form a code to inform Washington that they had indeed pulled off the first sustained nuclear reaction.
It meant that a weapon could be developed to end the war, but that work lay ahead. In the meantime, the conflict continued, and Chicagoans served. People of all races, people like Bill Thompson.
I enlisted because I wanted to fly. I wanted to become a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot or whatever. And the only place I could get any advanced flying would have been right here in Chicago at the Harlem Airport. Well, after I finished my training, they sent me down to Tuskegee. And there wasn't anything down there but 13 other cadets, flying cadets that were learning to fly. But even here, among those 13 that were down there, I would say about 60 or 70% of those guys already had pilot's license too, because they were all out of colleges that taught aviation. About 90% of the black enlisted men were college graduates. Some of them had masters, and we had one or two that had doctor's degrees. That's a fact. And the white enlisted personnel was not as astute educationally as our black enlisted personnel. These guys hadn't probably been to high school even. So they said, oh, you guys coming into the Air Corps? Yeah. Well, what are you guys going to be? You going to be the night fighters? We couldn't get angry with them because this is the best that they could do. They weren't too bright. I was an armament officer for a single squadron. I had 28 airplanes, and my job was to make certain that airplane was ready for action.
And the fighters were badly needed.
The bombers were losing almost 600 crew members a day being wiped out. These weren't black fellows, these were white fellows flying the bombers.
And so the Tuskegee Airmen, as they came to be known, were sent out to protect the bombers.
We'd rendezvous with them, take them to the target, and bring them home. For a while there, we shot down as many as 12 and 13 airplanes a day. We were interested in two things. First of all, they wanted to fly. The second thing, we were hoping that through our achievement, we'd be able to come back to America, and America would say, welcome home, fellas, you know, one of those things. But it wasn't like that. When we got home, the prisoners that were here were getting better treatment than we were.
Dempsey Travis had a similar experience in the service, only worse. He had been a musician in Chicago. He was drafted and sent to a camp in Ohio, which was, of course, segregated.
Like the cities, the Army had its own ghettos. And of course, we had a black ghetto where all the soldiers were housed. We didn't have a theater. We didn't have a post exchange. We didn't have anything.
Those amenities were on the white side of the camp.
The German prisoners could go to the theaters. German prisoners could go to the post exchange. German prisoners could go to the service club. And when we got on the bus to go to town, German prisoners rode in the front of the bus, and we rode in the back.
Finally, a tent was put up so that off-duty black soldiers could see movies.
It was July 11th, 1943, that I went to see Wuthering Heights. And when I came out, I was shot 3 times.
It happened because, unbeknownst to the men watching the movie, there had been a racial incident in another part of the camp.
A caravan of trucks moved in, surrounded the area, and like the snap of your finger, turned out all the lights and just started firing at will. Men were dropping like flies. I was shot down like a dog by white troops and wearing the same uniform that I was wearing, who obviously had no compassion for black people at all.
Travis recovered from his wounds and went on to the rank of sergeant.
My father, when I was promoted to sergeant, you would have thought that I was General MacArthur. He was so proud. He said, look at those stripes on my son's, you know, look at him, he's a smart boy, you know.
And so Travis found an iota of pride in his Army experience. But does he harbor bitterness as well?
Oh, no, I'm not bitter. I don't have time. I don't have time. And I just believe that bitterness destroys you.
Margaret Abramson, a member of another minority in the service, women, had a very different experience.
I'm a pioneer Chicagoan, and as they used to say, I loved every one of its dirty streets and alleys. I had worked with the USO for a year, and I had known what goes on with the Navy because we had this big Navy base at Navy Pier. I enlisted in December of 1942. The waves had just started because they were only organized about in July of 42. I was prepared for it because I had been going to nuns' school, wearing a blue uniform for 4 years, having discipline and obeying orders, and the Navy wasn't much different than what I was accustomed to.
She was assigned to the Charleston, South Carolina yard and put in charge of Navy relief.
And if we had a casualty, I would drive out in the country of South Carolina and visit the family and let them know that the Navy was there to help. I was commissioned an ensign. I was discharged as a full lieutenant, 2 stripes. We were Navy. We were not Girl Scouts. We had the same rank as men, and although I didn't do battle with the enemy, I relieved a man for sea duty. Somebody had to go to war because I took a desk job.
I mean, wars are generally fought by the young, and this was no exception.
One of them was Bill Cullerton.
Like any young fellow, at that time I guess I was 18. I was determined to get into the Air Force. And eventually, a couple of months later, I got called in.
His sweetheart lived in Oak Park, Elaine Stephen. All of her close friends, including Bill, called her by her nickname, Steve.
Bill Cullerton and I started going together when we both sophomores in high school.
I don't remember what I said to her other than that I'll be back.
Well, Bill was always the kind that would get into the fight, I think. You know, if something was going on or somebody needed him, I think he would be there.
He became a fighter pilot and was sent to Europe.
Our group went overseas as the first P-51 trained group.
I just saw a picture of the plane and it was Miss Steve, you know, and then from then on he had a few other planes and it was always Miss Steve.
We thought we'd whip him in no time. We got over there, we found out it was a little different. We were up against some guys, the Germans had been shooting down the poor Poles since 1939, so they had a lot of experienced pilots in the air.
And then when he came back from his first tour duty, that was in at Christmas time, and he gave me a ring. Then he went back overseas.
Bill proved to be a skilled fighter pilot and quickly became an ace.
An ace means that you have had 5 aerial victories. Well, I shot down 6 in the air, and I destroyed 21 on the ground, strafing.
He began to feel some guilt about his engagement to Steve.
I was mature enough then to know that the chances are of getting through a second tour are pretty tough. And I didn't get through the second tour. I got shot down. At the time I got hit, I was probably only 6 or 8 feet off the ground. So when I figured I was close enough, high enough, I bailed. I got out of there because that thing was going to blow any minute. I finally stopped, unhooked my chute. I got into the night very well. I spent the next several nights moving across southern Germany. I went to the Fenwick High School, and I still credit the inspiration of a high school coach named Tony Lawless. The inspiration that he gave me helped me through a lot of cold nights when I was evading in Germany. He always had a sign in his office that it's not the dog in the fight, but the fight in the dog.
He made his way toward the advancing American army. But then, in a small woods, he stumbled upon a group of retreating German soldiers.
The leader, probably a lieutenant or whatever, he took my gun, a .45, and he did speak a little English. He put the gun in my belly and he said, "For you, the war is over." And he shot me.
The first telegram was that Bill was missing in action, which was, of course, just terrible for everybody, and his folks were terribly upset.
I remember coming to in a hospital room, and there was a fellow leaning over me, and I was Catholic, am Catholic. I was wearing a crucifix. Well, this fellow spoke a little bit of English, the doctor. He was, as it turned out, not only the doctor, but he was a Jewish fellow. He said, "There are no priests here." I said, well, I understand that. He said, you're shot in the liver and you're going to die. You're bleeding to death. I didn't believe him, and I knew I wasn't dying.
Cullerton was right. But the hospital was run by the German military, which left him still in grave danger. Then, in the dark of one night, the doctor helped him escape.
I was wounded pretty bad and couldn't get around very well. So I worked my way to the edge of town. I found a culvert, and I decided then I'm going to spend the war here. And I got under the culvert, and pretty soon I can hear the American tanks coming, hear them coming. They established right away that I was an American, that I was wounded. They were ecstatic. They found, they were actually liberated a guy. They rescued me.
He had been shot down, he had been critically wounded, but he came home.
I love Chicago. I did then, and I do today even more. When you talk about coming home, it's a true homecoming. It was really a homecoming.
Well, of course, it was absolutely wonderful. We all were broken up, and his parents were there too, and his sister. It was just a wonderful time.
I got home, couldn't wait to see Steve. And as soon as we got together, I found out that we're going to get married in a couple weeks. So she locked me in a closet for 2 weeks, wouldn't let me out, and we got married.
The war caused Jack Hughes and his sweetheart Rita McHenry to hurry their wedding plans. They decided to be married in Evanston before he joined the Air Corps. During the time he trained to become a B-17 pilot, Rita became pregnant. Then it was time for Jack's last visit home.
Well, it came the last call for the train. We were lingering, and I giving hugs to everybody, and particularly to Rita. And because she was pretty pregnant, and I was going to miss the birth. And I was pretty sad. And I said, no, this is the last kiss. When I walk down that ramp, you'll all be here. I ain't going to turn around. I was afraid to.
But there would be one more goodbye. His base was in Nebraska. He had been assigned to go to England. It meant he could fly over Chicago on his way. He called Rita at home.
I should come over to your house in Evanston at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, that's what I'm aiming for. By the time I got down to Central Street and Prospect Avenue where they lived, it was right on the treetops. Right on the treetops. As I got up there where everybody could see me, and you just did what pilots always did. You waggled your wings. I kept waggling until I was out of sight. And that was a goodbye. I flew 10 missions over Germany, and we had a few incidents.
On his 5th mission, his bomber was badly hit with flak.
So we decided that there was just no sense of flying an airplane that was going to maybe explode. We didn't know. So the best way to put the fire out was to ditch it. So we ditched.
Into the North Sea.
The next day, the high-speed launches found us, took us into northern England. So much for that. It was fine. We got back to the base. We got a 5-day ditching leave in London, and then you're back to duty.
On his 10th mission, they were hit again, this time over France. The crew bailed out.
I free fell all the way from the 22,000 down to about 1,500, 1,000 feet. It was pretty quick, because after I pulled the chute, I hit the ground. That was close enough.
They were rescued and hidden by the French resistance, who got them to the Pyrenees and an escape route to Spain.
And then we walked 25 miles inland, and we climbed over the Pyrenees by foot.
Eventually, Jack Hughes made it back to England and the United States.
I said in the telegram, you are invited to a homecoming party at Chicago Municipal Airport, 5:05 p.m. tomorrow. They were all there. I mean, the first time I fed the baby, and held him in my arms. Well, it just You come back from the dead and here all of a sudden you've got new life in your hands. It's quite an experience.
Jack Hughes and his beloved wife Rita were married for 56 years. She died in December of '96.
Rita was a great religious woman, and while I was overseas, maybe after I got shot down the first time, she made a retreat at St. Athanasius Church, novena to St. Jude. And that day she promised St. Jude that if I could come home, she would say a rosary the rest of her life. And never missed. Over 60,000 times. And that's one of the nice memories I have.
You'd be so nice to come home to. You'd be so nice by the fire, while the breeze on high sang a lullaby. You'd be all that I could desire.
There were a lot of people who lied about their age and dropped out of high school and went off into the military, actually quite sizable numbers.
Bob McGuigan was one of them. His childhood sweetheart was Gloria Essig.
Bob and I were dating at the time. He told me that he had enlisted and that he was going to be gone, and could he write to me? I knew he was going to be going to the Pacific because that's where he was in San Diego, and I knew the war was really accelerated there.
He became a gunner's mate and was assigned to the heavy cruiser, the USS Indianapolis. He and his shipmates took part in many battles. What Gloria didn't know, what virtually no one knew, was that Bob's ship was assigned to carry 2 atomic bombs to a remote island in the Pacific, a base for US B-29s. A young Chicago pilot was there, Fred Olivi.
I grew up on 111th and Langley, not too far from the gate, one of the gates of the Pullman shop. And my uncle had an Italian restaurant in the basement of the house that he owned at the time.
As a kid, Fred read every aviation magazine he could get hold of. It was natural that he would enlist in the Army Air Corps. He completed his training as a B-29 pilot in 1944.
I got sent to the South Pacific. I ended up being one of the co-pilots on the atomic missions.
Olivi and the entire crew had known for some time what they were about to do. They were made even more aware when Hiroshima was destroyed.
This was the second bombing, and we were ordered and we were briefed that we were supposed to drop visually only with the Norden bomb sight. And so we immediately started to look for a hole in the clouds.
They found it over Nagasaki, a small one. The bombardier made the most of it.
So he had 45 seconds to set up the bomb sight. He killed the drift and made sure that we were on course. And in the 45 seconds, he set that up and we dropped the bomb. And I remember we were in bright sunlight, and when the bomb exploded, it was a bright bluish light that filled the entire aircraft. And when we looked down, the entire city was covered with dust and smoke, and there were little fires that were breaking out all over that we could see. And of course, out of the center of the city came the telltale mushroom cloud that is associated with the atomic bombings. But I'll never forget the cloud itself, because it was such a memorable thing that, again, I'll never forget it.
Neither will Mario Tonelli, the former Chicago athlete who survived the Bataan Death March.
When we were in prison camp, the Japanese tried to tell us what something about this thing that took everything, just burned everything up, you know. We thought they were reading Buck Roger books. And the next day they started to drop food to us in 55-gallon drums.
When the war was over, we had such a big celebration.
We got some toilet paper and threw, you know, on the street and had celebrating the end of the war.
The downtown area was just loaded with people, wall-to-wall people. But there never was a glass broken, door front broken, or anything.
I was just glad the war was over with. It was the end of all of those sort of frightening things that had been going on.
So 2 of us girls were Catholics, so we went to church. And we came back from church, and the other two girls were in their room, and they're crying. And I said, you know, what's the matter? Did something happen to one of their family or something? And they hand me the Tribune, and it said, you know, that the victory over Japan. But in the one column, it said the USS Indianapolis sunk, 100% casualties.
But fortunately, the word casualty does not necessarily mean dead, and Bob McGuigan wasn't. But the war was not over for him. On its return run from delivering the bomb, the Indianapolis and her crew had run into hell.
We were hit by 3 torpedoes, so everybody getting off the ship, wherever they got off or if they were blown off, they were quite a distance apart.
Survivors swam toward each other.
We put the wounded in the center and the guys that didn't have life jackets.
And then their worst fears came true. They began to get picked off, one by one.
We had sharks every night. Anybody they'd grab your legs and bite your legs. See? And maybe it's like the guy that I tried to wake up next to me, he just turned over edge. When I tried to wake him up, there was no bottom there. Kept myself in a cannonball. I never looked into the water because every one of them guys that looked in the water went nuts. Went crazy over the sharks. About the 4th day, a B-17 came flying over and threw out some ramps. I told the guys in the group I was going to swim for that life raft. There was 880 people were lost. 317 of us lived to be picked up.
It is estimated that by the end of the war, the average Chicago block had 7 people in the service. Now, most were coming home.
When you came towards the harbor, you could see that Statue of Liberty there. I tell you, that's a sight to behold.
When I got down to the gangplank in New York, I kissed the ground.
Let me tell you something, the flag is a symbol of freedom. And I remember when I first saw it, I started to cry, you know.
I took the North Shore line onto the elevated train and came home on a streetcar. I guess the old man almost passed out, you know, when he saw me.
They were home, and that was good. But was it the good war?
Well, that's ironic. You notice in my book I have it in quotation marks, the good war, because the adjective good and the noun war don't match. Even World War II, which if ever there was a just war, if ever there was one, I don't think there is one, but if there was one, it would be World War II.
Well, I think it was the good war because it was also, in a sense, the feel-good war, because people had an identifiable enemy. There was our enemies. It was very clear in terms of our objectives, our goals. I think it had long-term impacts for things like civil rights. Many African Americans were very incensed by their treatment, often in the military. You know, it's the old question of when you've gone away and you've thought about it and you come back, things can never be the same. And I think that was very much the case of the war.
Dempsey Travis went on to become a real estate developer, mortgage banker, best-selling author, and philanthropist. But it took the government some 50 years to even acknowledge that Travis had been shot by troops of his own army. He recently received a disability check for $70,000. John Simpson, who worked on the Manhattan Project, remained at the University of Chicago, teaching physics, and tirelessly pursued the peaceful use of atomic energy. John Long, sent to medical school by the Army, became a revered Chicago obstetrician, and during his career delivered some 12,000 babies. Mario Tonelli, survivor of the Bataan Death March, came home to play one more season for the Chicago Cardinals, and then went on to a successful career in business and government. Fred Olivi, who bombed Nagasaki, became a commissioner of the city of Chicago and remained in the Air Force Reserve long enough to reach the rank of lieutenant colonel. George Gutterly, who saved Wayland Buckholz's life, stood up at his wedding. They remain fast friends to this day. Gutterly eventually became executive director of the Illinois Tollway Commission. Mortimer Abramson, the Marine who was at Pearl Harbor, met a pretty wave on the railroad platform at Great Lakes. And even though she outranked him, he fell in love. He and Margaret have been married now some 50 years. After the war, Tuskegee Airman Bill Thompson hoped to become a commercial pilot. But because of prejudice, those doors were closed to him. So he and his wife Vera helped others spread their wings. They taught in the Chicago public schools for a combined 50-plus years. Bill Cullerton founded a large and successful sporting goods sales organization. Unfortunately, he has always suffered from the gunshot wound to his stomach. Bob and Gloria McWiggin had 2 sons who served in the military. Their life has been happy and peaceful, except Bob has never really slept well since the war. He dreams of sharks. And all of the Chicagoans who took part in World War II have feelings about what they lived through.
Yes, I'm proud to have served. I would do it again for my country.
We were looked upon as being quite favored among our own people because they were very proud of us. We were proud of ourselves.
And I think as women, we made a particular contribution on the home front that can't be negated. I think it's important.
When I took that uniform off, I went back to civilian life, but I really never took the uniform off. I still wear the shadow of the uniform. I loved it. I loved the service.
I think the most meaningful thing to me was the fact that we had won the war and we had kept the war away from our shores.
World War II raged from 1939 to 1945. It was fought primarily in Europe and the South Pacific. Yet Chicago was at the center of the fight, and so were her people.
Till then, my darling, please wait for me. Till then, no matter when it will be, one day, I know I'll be back again. Please wait. Till then, let's dream of what there will be. Till then, we'll call on each memory. Till then, when I